All right, hands up if you know what skiffle is. I do, because I'm about to tell you about it. It is or was a musical craze that struck a chord in the 1950s in British pop culture between the end of the war and the rise of the Beatles. Yet despite its importance, the genre hasn't been given its full due by pop historians until now. A new book is shining a very bright spotlight on skiffle. It's called Roots, Radicals, and Rockers, and it's written by none other than Billy Bragg, who joins us here this morning in studio. Billy, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, man. Good to be here.
It feels like a very personal story. It feels like a labor of love.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's something that I lived through the whole punk thing in the 1970s. In some ways, skiffle is very similar to punk because it allowed these kids, these young British kids, our first generation of teenagers, to define themselves through music. It was the first time this had happened. What happens is this guy named Lonnie Donegan has a hit in 1956 with an old Leadbelly song called Rock Island Line. And it just starts a craze. It's like a craze like the fidget spinners at the moment.
Okay.
It's like that, more than it's really like punk rock. Every sentient British schoolboy learns 3 chords on the guitar. And as a result, when Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry turn up 6, 7 months later, they can all play that stuff.
Yeah.
And it leads directly to the Beatles, to the British invasion, the American charts. These kids all learned to play guitar during the skiffle craze.
So you came up about 20, 25 years later. So how did you learn about skiffle, and how did you learn about it to the point that you said, all right, I got to write a book about this?
Well, I sort of worked with people who were hugely influenced by it. A guy named John Peel, probably our greatest radio DJ. He kind of discovered me and lots of other great bands like the Smiths, and Led Zeppelin. He did a lot of work with them. He invited me out to dinner with this guy, Lonnie Donegan, one time, which was interesting for me because I was into skiffle. And John Peel didn't speak to him at all the time we were there, and I couldn't understand what it was. It turned out he was so in awe of Lonnie Donegan.
Really?
Because Donegan had been a giant when he was a kid. In some ways, Lonnie Donegan is to that generation what Neil Armstrong is to my generation. Everyone knows his name. Sure. Everyone knows where they were when they first heard this song, Rock Island Line. But
not a lot of these musicians, these skiffle musicians, cracked the sort of radio. They didn't have a lot of radio play.
No, because predominantly they were so young. I mean, Van Morrison, I speak to Van Morrison in the book, he was 12 when he first said it. They were so young. George Harrison was 13, Paul McCartney was 14, John Lennon was 16.
So it was like a proto-pop.
It was, very much so, but they were also, what's really crucial is they were the first generation of British teenagers to be defined not as children or adults. They were born, Lennon was born in 1940, so they lived through the war, and they also lived through rationing, which went on until 1954. So someone like John Lennon, as a child and a young teen, was never able to go in a sweet shop and buy whatever he wanted. So as soon as they start going to work and earning a bit of money, they've got something to spend. They want to define themselves, and they use this music and playing the guitar to define themselves as different to their parents' generation.
So what did their parents think of this music?
They thought it was terrible. They thought it was unmusical. They thought they were throwing everything away, and they thought it was like a kind of rebellion. That's why it's kind of similar to punk. The thing about punk rock, the great slogan from punk rock was, here's 3 chords, now form a group. And this is exactly the same as it was in skiffle. Well,
I guess people who haven't heard it are probably listening to this, trying to wrap their head around it. You're saying it wasn't musical. Was it optimistic? Was it juvenile? Was it?
I'll tell you what it was. It was a bunch of kids who'd grown up in a very difficult time, a time of what we call make, do, and mend. You know, they were just getting through the war, and they desperately wanted the future to happen. So they were using this music. It was American music. It was predominantly African-American music. Although it was old-time music, they were using it to build a bridge to the future, and it ultimately built a bridge that stretched across the Atlantic and allowed them to take over the American charts in 1964, 1965.
So you said a lot of these kids were exactly that, kids, but eventually those kids grow up. And did any of them have the skill to take those 3 chords and take that unmusical music and turn it into a big career?
Well, 60 years ago this month, John Lennon's skiffle band, the Quarrymen, were playing a church fete in Liverpool, and a guy named Ivan brought a friend of his along called Paul McCartney. And Paul McCartney impressed John Lennon so much that he joined the skiffle band. Eventually, George Harrison joins the skiffle band. And those bands go on. In 1964, when the Beatles break the American charts, there's a period of 2 years in which 52 weeks of those 2 years, there's a British band at #1 in the Billboard charts. Every one of those British bands began as a skiffle group in the mid-50s.
Really?
Yeah.
Did they identify as skiffle?
No, they didn't, because they were so young. They were 12, 13, 14. What happens in 1967, Sgt. Pepper's comes out and pop turns into rock. And Rolling Stone magazine, also 1967, If you're a British rock star and Rolling Stone are asking who influenced you, you're likely to say Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley rather than, you know, Chas McDavitt and Nancy Whiskey.
Well, Billy, thank you so much for being here. You know, you take a look at a book like this and you realize how little you actually know about music. Not you specifically, because you know it all.
Well, skiffle special. Not many people know about that, but I might have to change that.
And I really appreciate. I think a lot of people who say they love music would love to learn about skiffle and how important it is. Billy, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.